Echoes of Opportunity, Octavia. Reynolds tucked her cello into the corner of her modest apartment and collapsed onto her couch. Her fingers still tingled from the 6-hour practice session at the community orchestra. At 32, she had long abandoned her dreams of symphony stardom, instead finding quiet fulfillment in teaching music to neighborhood children and performing with the local ensemble. The sharp ring of her phone cut through her exhaustion. Her conductor's name flashed across the screen. Thomas. Is everything all right? She answered, concern edging her voice. Better than all right, he replied breathlessly. I've just had a call from Helix Foundation. Their string quartet canceled for tomorrow night's charity gala, and they need replacements immediately. I recommended you and 3 others. Octavia sat up straight. The Helix Foundation? As in Julian Blackwood's tech empire? The very same. It pays $5,000 for one. Evening, Octavia. She nearly dropped her phone. $5,000 would cover 3 months of rent. With her mounting student loans and her mother's medical bills, this wasn't an opportunity. It was a lifeline. I'll do it, she said, already mentally selecting the appropriate formal attire from her limited wardrobe. The next evening, Octavia arrived at the Blackwood Innovation Center, a gleaming architectural marvel of glass and sustainable materials perched on the city's waterfront. She clutched her instrument case tightly as a valet directed her to the service entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was controlled chaos. Event staff in crisp black uniforms darted between extravagant flower arrangements and ice sculptures. A harried event coordinator named Penelope briefed Octavia and her colleagues on their performance schedule. You'll play during cocktails, then again during dessert. Please remain unobtrusive during dinner, Penelope instructed, barely looking up from her tablet. The guests tonight represent over $2 trillion in combined wealth. They're here to open their checkbooks for educational initiatives in developing countries. As they set up in the corner of the grand ballroom, Octavia glimpsed the guest list. Tech moguls, finance titans, and innovation leaders from around the globe were beginning to arrive in designer formal wear that probably cost more than her annual salary. Don't gawk, whispered Darren, the first violinist. They hate when the help stares. Octavia nodded, focusing instead on tuning her cello. Soon they began playing a selection of classical pieces chosen for their inoffensive elegance. As her bow glided across the strings, Octavia allowed herself to become immersed in the music, barely noticing the room filling with the world's elite. During a brief break, she slipped away to find water. Turning a corner too quickly, she collided with someone, sending her sheet music scattering across the polished floor. I'm so sorry, she stammered, dropping to her knees to gather the papers. Entirely my fault, replied a quiet male voice as the stranger knelt beside her. When she looked up, Octavia found herself face to face with Julian Blackwood himself. Unlike the media portrayals of a confident, almost intimidating figure, up close he seemed tired, his eyes carrying a weight that contradicted his perfectly tailored tuxedo and carefully styled dark hair. You're with the quartet, he observed, handing her several pages of music. Yes, last-minute replacement, she replied, trying to maintain her composure. Fortunate for us, he said. Vivaldi's Winter was particularly moving. Surprised that he had actually been listening and could identify the piece, Octavia smiled genuinely. Thank you. Though I always feel it needs more passion in the allegro. Non molto. Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps at her candor. For a moment, the billionaire and the cellist simply looked at each other, an unexpected current of recognition passing between them. Julian, called a voice from down the hallway. The Singaporean investors are asking for you. He stood, straightening his jacket. Duty calls. Perhaps we can continue this discussion of Vivaldi later, Ms. Reynolds. Octavia Reynolds. Octavia, he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name. Like the musical interval. With a slight nod, he was gone, swallowed by the glittering crowd of the world's most powerful people. Octavia returned to her position, wondering why her heart was beating so rapidly and why, for the first time in years, The music flowing from her cello suddenly felt alive with new possibility. Midnight conversations. The gala proceeded with mechanical precision. Champagne flutes clinked, polite laughter echoed across marble floors, and philanthropic pledges accumulated into the millions as Octavia's quartet provided a sophisticated soundtrack. Through it all, she found her gaze occasionally drifting toward Julian Blackwood, who moved through the crowd with practiced ease that never quite reached his eyes. Around midnight, as the event wound down and guests departed in sleek cars, Octavia packed her cello while her colleagues chatted about their generous tips. "Heading straight home?" asked Darren, slipping his violin into its case. "I thought I might enjoy the view from the terrace first," she replied. "How often do we get access to places like this?" After her friends left, Octavia made her way to the west-facing terrace. The staff was busy cleaning inside, leaving the outdoor space deserted. A gentle breeze carried the scent of the ocean as city lights sparkled below. Octavia closed her eyes, committing the moment to memory. "It's more peaceful without the crowd, isn't it?" She turned to find Julian Blackwood emerging from the shadows, his bow tie undone and jacket discarded. He held 2 glasses of amber liquid. "I hope you don't mind company," he said, offering her one of the glasses. 18-year-old Scotch. A celebration seems appropriate after raising $60 million tonight. Octavia accepted the drink. "I've never tried Scotch before." "Then I apologize in advance. Most people find it an acquired taste." She took a small sip, managing not to grimace as the liquid burned down her throat. "I can see why." Julian laughed, a genuine sound so different from his polite chuckles during the gala. Honesty, refreshing. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, gazing at the cityscape. "Do you enjoy these events, Mr. Blackwood?" Octavia finally asked. "Julian, please." He swirled his drink thoughtfully. "And no, not particularly. They're necessary performances." "Performances," she echoed. "That's an interesting way to describe charity." He glanced at her. "Does that sound cynical?" "Realistic, perhaps. We were all performing tonight in our own ways." Julian leaned against the railing. "What about you? Do you enjoy playing at events like this?" "I enjoy playing anywhere," Octavia replied. "But I prefer when people actually listen to the music, rather than using it as sophisticated background noise. Like Winter from the Four Seasons," he noted. "You mentioned it needed more passion." Octavia smiled, surprised he remembered. "It's meant to evoke the harshness of winter, the bitter cold, the struggle. Most performances are too polite." "And life isn't polite," Julian observed. "Exactly." A comfortable silence settled between them. Julian loosened his collar and sighed. "Do you know what I was thinking throughout tonight's endless small talk? That I'd rather be in my workshop, building something with my hands." Octavia raised an eyebrow. "The tech visionary prefers manual labor?" "I started as an engineer, not a CEO," he said with a half-smile. "Creating something tangible, that's where I find purpose, not in galas or board meetings." "Then why host this event?" she asked. "Because I can leverage what I've built to make a difference. $60 million will fund educational technology for thousands of children." His voice softened. "My parents were teachers in a chronically underfunded district. I watched them buy supplies with their own limited salaries." Understanding dawned on Octavia. "So this isn't just business for you?" "Few things worth doing ever are." Julian turned toward her. "What about you? Has music always been your path?" Octavia considered the question. "My mother played cello with the City Symphony before her illness. She taught me everything." She traced the rim of her glass. "I had dreams of joining a major orchestra, but life had other plans." "What happened?" "Reality," she said simply. "Medical bills, student loans. I teach music to children now and play with community orchestras. It's not the dream, but there's meaning in it." Julian studied her. "You don't seem bitter." "What would be the point? Besides, seeing a child connect with music for the first time, that's its own kind of magic." The conversation flowed effortlessly as the night deepened. They discovered shared interests in classic literature and obscure documentaries. They debated the ethics of emerging technologies and laughed about their mutual dislike of seafood. Hours passed unnoticed. Julian checked his watch and looked surprised. "It's nearly 3 in the morning." "I should go," Octavia said reluctantly, placing her empty glass on a nearby table. "Allow me to arrange transportation." She shook her head. "The subway is fine." "At this hour? I insist. Not as a billionaire." Being chivalrous, he added, seeing her expression, "but as someone who would do the same for any friend." Friend. The word hung between them, surprising and yet somehow fitting. As they walked toward the elevator, Julian stopped suddenly. "I have an unorthodox request." Octavia waited expectantly. "Would you play something? Something real, the way you believe Vivaldi should sound?" The request was so earnest that Octavia found herself nodding. They returned to the now empty ballroom where her cello waited. In the dimmed lights, with only Julian as her audience, Octavia drew her bow across the strings and poured everything into her performance. All the day's emotions, the unexpected connection, the strange feeling that something significant was happening. When the final note faded, Julian remained silent for a long moment. "That," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is what winter truly feels like." Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a recognition. As dawn approached, and Octavia finally departed in the car Julian had called, both sensed that their worlds, which had collided by chance, might never quite be the same again. Ripples of change. 3 months passed since the night of the Helix Foundation Gala. Spring had arrived in the city, bringing cherry blossoms and gentle rain showers, but Octavia found herself thinking of winter, specifically Vivaldi's Winter, and the man who had listened to her play it with such undivided attention. She hadn't seen Julian Blackwood since that night. How could she? Their worlds existed on different planes, their brief intersection nothing more than a pleasant anomaly. Yet something had shifted inside her since their conversation. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Octavia sat in a coffee shop near the community center where she taught, reviewing applications for her music scholarship program. Using the generous payment from the gala, she had established a small fund to provide lessons for children who couldn't afford them. "Is this seat taken?" asked a familiar voice. Octavia looked up, startled to find Julian standing before her. Gone was the tuxedo, replaced by a simple gray sweater and jeans that somehow made him look both more approachable and more striking. "Julian," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "What are you doing here?" He gestured to the chair across from her. "May I?" She nodded, quickly gathering her scattered papers. "I was meeting with the education board about implementing some new technology programs," he explained, settling into the seat. "Their offices are nearby." He paused. "Though I admit, I've stopped by this coffee shop several times hoping to run into you." Octavia's heart performed an unexpected allegro. "You could have called. The quartet coordinator has my number." "I considered that," Julian admitted. "But it seemed presumptuous." An awkward silence fell between them, so different from their easy conversation months ago. "How have you been?" they both asked simultaneously, then laughed. "You first," Octavia insisted. Julian ran a hand through his hair, slightly longer now than at the gala. "I've been making changes. After our conversation, I realized how disconnected I'd become from what actually matters to me." He leaned forward. "I've stepped back from day-to-day operations at Helix, appointed a new CEO." "That's significant," Octavia said, genuinely surprised. "What are you doing instead?" "Returning to my roots. I've set up a workshop where I'm developing prototypes for assistive technology devices." His eyes lit up as he spoke. "Simple tools that can help children with disabilities access education more effectively. No profit motive, just pure creation for purpose." Octavia smiled, recognizing the passion in his voice. "That sounds fulfilling." "It is." He nodded toward her papers. "And you?" What's all this? She explained her scholarship program, watching, his expression warm as she described the children who would benefit. That's wonderful, Octavia. Truly. It's small scale compared to your foundation's work, she said. Scale isn't the point. Impact is. Julian's gaze was earnest. One child learning music who otherwise couldn't. That's a universe changed. They talked for nearly 2 hours, catching up as if they were old friends rather than two people who had shared a single meaningful conversation. Julian described his new daily routine, which included actual sleep and meals that weren't eaten during meetings. Octavia told him about her students and her recently increased involvement with community orchestras. I've been playing differently, she confessed. With more passion, Julian suggested. Yes. She met his eyes. I keep thinking about what you said that night, about performances and authenticity. I've thought about that conversation every day, Julian admitted quietly. Before Octavia could respond, her phone alarm chimed. I have to go. A lesson in 20 minutes. Julian nodded, disappointment flickering across his face. Of course. As they stood to leave, an awkward tension settled between them. The unspoken acknowledgement that whatever connection they'd formed didn't easily fit into either of their lives. It was good seeing you, Julian, Octavia said finally. Likewise. He hesitated. Octavia, I've been invited to speak at a conference on educational technology next weekend. Afterward, the Boston Symphony is performing the Four Seasons. He took a breath. Would you consider joining me? Professionally speaking, of course. I'd value your expertise on whether their winter has adequate passion. The invitation hung between them, a bridge from one world to another. I'd like that, she said simply. Over the following weeks, that initial reunion led to others. They attended the symphony together, where their hands accidentally brushed during the allegro movement of winter, neither pulling away. They met for coffee between Octavia's lessons. Julian invited her to tour his workshop, where she watched him passionately explain prototypes designed to help children with motor difficulties play musical instruments. For Julian, Octavia's presence brought color back into a life that had become monochromatic with obligation. He found himself laughing more, observing the world more closely, appreciating beauty he had stopped noticing years ago. For Octavia, Julian's friendship offered new perspectives and possibilities. His genuine interest in her ideas and his respect for her work reminded her of ambitions she had reluctantly set aside. With his encouragement, she submitted an application for a prestigious music education fellowship she would never have considered before. Neither spoke openly about how their brief encounter had altered their trajectories. Yet with each meeting, the ripples of change spread further through their lives, transforming them in ways neither had anticipated that night under the gala's glittering lights. On a rainy evening in late spring, Octavia received 2 pieces of news. Her fellowship application had been accepted, offering her the chance to study innovative music education approaches in Vienna for 6 months. And Helix Foundation was hosting another charity gala, this time focused on arts accessibility, a focus Julian had recently championed. Standing by her apartment window, Octavia watched raindrops trace patterns on the glass and wondered whether some connections were meant to be temporary catalysts rather than permanent fixtures. The thought brought an unexpected ache. Vienna represented a dream opportunity, yet the prospect of leaving stirred a complicated reluctance she hadn't anticipated. She picked up her phone and stared at Julian's contact information, her finger hovering over the call button as she contemplated how to share her news and what it might mean for whatever was growing between them. Crossing divides. The Helix Foundation's Arts Accessibility Gala transformed the city's modern art museum into a wonderland of interactive installations. Unlike the previous event's formal rigidity, this evening encouraged participation. Guests, in cocktail attire, created collaborative murals, experimented with adaptive instruments, and engaged with performers of all abilities. Octavia circulated through the crowd not as hired entertainment, but as Julian's invited guest. She wore a simple emerald dress purchased with her fellowship stipend, modest compared to the designer fashions surrounding her, yet elegant in its simplicity. "Professor Whitaker is absolutely fascinated by your adaptive music program," Julian said, returning to her side after networking with potential donors. In his charcoal suit with no tie, he looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him at a formal event. "He wants to implement something similar at the university." Octavia smiled. "That's wonderful, though I can't take credit. It was your engineering that made the instruments possible." "Our collaboration," he corrected gently. The word hung between them. Over the past weeks, they had indeed collaborated. Julian adapting instruments for children with physical limitations, Octavia developing teaching methodologies for them. Their professional partnership had flourished, while the personal dimension of their relationship remained carefully undefined. "Have you told anyone about Vienna?" Julian asked quietly. "Not yet," she admitted. "The fellowship feels too good to be true. 6 months studying innovative music education approaches with leading experts." "It's exactly what you deserve," Julian said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "When do you leave?" "August 15th, just under 2 months from now." Before Julian could respond, they were interrupted by a tall woman in an impeccable white pantsuit. "Julian, darling, you've been holding out on us," the woman said, eyeing Octavia with undisguised curiosity. "Vanessa," Julian acknowledged with a slight stiffness. "Allow me to introduce Octavia Reynolds, music educator and consultant for our Adaptive Instruments Initiative. Octavia, Vanessa Harrington, Head of Investor Relations at Helix." "Consultant," Vanessa repeated with a knowing smile. "How refreshing. Julian hasn't brought a date to a foundation event in years." "We're colleagues," Julian stated firmly. "Of course," Vanessa replied, clearly unconvinced. "Well, your colleague is causing quite a stir. The board members are intrigued by Julian Blackwood's mysterious companion." After Vanessa glided away, an uncomfortable silence fell between them. "I apologize for her," Julian finally said. "Corporate culture can be invasive," Octavia suggested. "Precisely." A string quartet began playing in the central gallery, drawing guests in that direction. Julian and Octavia remained where they were, suddenly aware of the growing divide between public perception and their unspoken reality. "Perhaps we should join the others," Octavia suggested. Julian hesitated. "Actually, there's something I'd like to show you first." He guided her away from the crowd, toward a secluded balcony overlooking the city. "I come here sometimes when the museum is closed to the public, one of the perks of being a major donor." The night skyline stretched before them, a tapestry of lights against darkness. For a moment they stood in silence, shoulders almost touching. "I received an offer today," Julian said finally. "The Education Ministry in Singapore wants me to implement our adaptive technology program throughout their school system. It would mean relocating for at least a year." Octavia felt a sharp pang in her chest. "That's an incredible opportunity." "Yes." "When would you leave?" "September 1st. Julian turned to face her. 2 weeks after you depart for Vienna." The timing hung between them, a cosmic joke or perhaps a merciful alignment. "We're both leaving," Octavia said softly. "It appears so." A server approached with champagne, then retreated quickly, sensing the tension. "Julian," Octavia began carefully, "what are we doing?" He met her gaze directly. "I've been asking myself the same question. We've been careful, haven't we? Keeping everything professional. Colleagues, as you told Vanessa." "Is that what you want, to be colleagues?" Julian asked, his voice controlled. Octavia gripped the balcony railing. "What I want isn't practical. You're establishing global education initiatives. I'm teaching children to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. That's not how I see you, but it's my reality." She turned to him. "Our worlds don't align, Julian. What happened at the first gala, the connection we felt, it was beautiful, but perhaps it was just meant to redirect us toward our true paths. You back to creating with purpose. Me toward pursuing music. Education more seriously. Julian stepped closer. Is that what you truly believe? That we were just catalysts for each other's growth? Isn't that significant enough? She countered, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. What if we could be more? His question was barely above a whisper. How? We'll be on different continents in 2 months. Julian ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Vienna and Singapore are just locations, Octavia. We're both pursuing what matters to us. That's the alignment that counts. And after our projects end, you return to running a global tech empire, and I go back to teaching community music classes. Do we have to know the entire future to acknowledge what's happening between us now? Before she could answer, his phone buzzed insistently. Julian checked it with obvious reluctance. The major donors are gathering for the announcement, he said. I'm expected to give a speech. You should go, Octavia said. Julian hesitated. This conversation isn't finished. No, she agreed, but your guests are waiting. As they returned to the gala, the professional masks slipped back into place. Julian became the charismatic visionary addressing wealthy supporters. Octavia became the respectful colleague observing from the periphery. Yet beneath these personas, the unresolved question pulsed. Were they brave enough to bridge their different worlds, or wise enough to recognize the impracticality of trying? Later that evening, as Julian was surrounded by potential investors, Octavia slipped away. She left a handwritten note with the coat check. Some divides exist for a reason. I'm grateful for our crossing paths. Wishing you every success in Singapore. In her modest apartment, Octavia began sorting through music scores, preparing for Vienna, trying to convince herself she had made the prudent choice. Yet when she picked up Vivaldi's Winter, the memory of playing it for Julian and his profound understanding of her interpretation brought tears to her eyes. Across the city, in his penthouse overlooking the harbor, Julian read Octavia's note for the 3rd time. On his desk lay 2 airline tickets, one to Vienna for August 20th, another to Singapore for September 1st. Between these destinations and dates lay a decision about what truly mattered in a life he had recently begun to rebuild. Harmonious Resolution Vienna embraced August with imperial splendor. Historic buildings basked in golden sunshine as Octavia made her way through the Musikverein district, her fellowship orientation materials clutched in one hand, a small city map in the other. After a week in this musical mecca, she still felt caught between wonder and displacement. Her apartment, provided by the fellowship program, overlooked a quaint courtyard where an elderly violinist practiced each morning. The building housed several music students and educators from around the world, creating an impromptu community of kindred spirits. By all measures, she should have been elated. Yet something was missing. Pausing at a cafe, Octavia ordered in her limited German and settled at an outdoor table. The fellowship had exceeded her expectations professionally. Yesterday she had observed a revolutionary program integrating music therapy with traditional education for children with learning differences. Tomorrow, she would begin shadowing Vienna's foremost expert on accessible music education. She opened her notebook, reviewing her observations and ignoring the hollow feeling that had accompanied her since leaving home. Since leaving, excuse me, is this seat taken? The voice, familiar, impossible, sent a shock through her system. Octavia looked up slowly, certain she was imagining things. Julian Blackwood stood before her, casual in jeans and a light blue button-down shirt, looking simultaneously out of place and perfectly at home on the Viennese street. Julian, she whispered, convinced she was hallucinating. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Singapore. He gestured to the empty chair. May I? She nodded mutely, watching as he sat across from her. I rescheduled Singapore, he said simply. Some things were more important. Octavia's mind raced. I don't understand. How did you even find me? Vienna isn't that large, especially when one knows which fellowship program to contact. A small smile played at his lips. Being a major donor to arts education has its advantages. You can't just, she began, then stopped, unsure what she was protesting. Julian leaned forward. After you left the gala, I kept thinking about what you said, about divides existing for a reason. His eyes held hers steadily. I disagree. Waiter approached with Julian's coffee, giving Octavia a moment to collect herself. You disagree, she repeated when they were alone again. Completely. Julian's certainty was palpable. Divides exist because we construct them. Different backgrounds, different tax brackets, different daily realities, these are circumstances, not fundamental incompatibilities. It's not that simple, Octavia countered. No, it's incredibly complex, he agreed. Which is why I'm here. Complexity deserves careful consideration, not abandonment. The street around them bustled with tourists and locals. But for Octavia, everything had narrowed to this table, this conversation, this impossible man who had followed her across continents. What about Singapore? She asked. Still happening, but starting in October instead of September. Julian took a sip of his coffee. The real question is, what about us? The directness of his question momentarily silenced her. That night at the first gala, Julian continued, his voice softening, when you played Winter the way it should be played, with raw honesty and without tempering its harshness, you reminded me what authenticity feels like. I'd been performing a version of myself for so long I'd forgotten the original. And I've been living a diminished version of my dreams, Octavia admitted quietly, until you encouraged me to reach for more. So yes, we were catalysts for each other, Julian acknowledged, but that doesn't mean the reaction has to end. A string quartet began playing in the small square nearby, the notes of Mozart floating through the afternoon air. What are you proposing exactly? Octavia asked. Julian reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of hers. I'm proposing we stop creating obstacles. Your fellowship lasts 6 months. My Singapore project lasts a year. But there are these remarkable inventions called airplanes that can cross international boundaries in hours. Despite herself, Octavia smiled. Long-distance relationships aren't exactly simple. Few things worth having are. His gaze was unwavering. I can work from Vienna for the next month before Singapore begins. After that, we navigate one step at a time. Because here's what I know with absolute certainty. In my entire life, I've never met anyone who challenges and understands me the way you do. It's terrifying, Octavia whispered. What you're suggesting? Completely, Julian agreed. Almost as terrifying as pretending we can walk away from this connection. Her fingers bridged the final distance, touching his. I tried that already. It didn't work very well. Something shifted in the air between them, possibility crystallizing into probability. I have a suggestion, Julian said, intertwining his fingers with hers. For the next month, let's explore Vienna together. No pressure, no declarations, no decisions about a hypothetical future. Just two people who connect in a rare way, discovering a magnificent city. And after that month, we'll know more about what we want, about whether this is something worth fighting for across continents. The quartet in the square transitioned to Vivaldi. Octavia recognized the familiar notes of summer filling the air. Passionate, tempestuous, alive. A month in Vienna, she repeated thoughtfully. It sounds like the beginning of a story, or the middle of one, Julian suggested. The following weeks unfolded like movements in a concerto. Mornings found Octavia attending her fellowship program, while Julian worked remotely from his hotel or various cafes. Afternoons and evenings they spent together, attending concerts at the Musikverein, wandering through museums, discovering hidden courtyards where musicians had composed centuries of masterpieces. They spoke of everything and nothing. Julian described growing up with educator parents who valued learning above material success, explaining how his eventual wealth had created both opportunities and disconnections. Octavia shared stories of her mother's influence, her own abandoned performing ambitions, and her growing passion for making music accessible to all children. They argued about films, collaborated on adaptations of classical pieces for students with different abilities, and gradually dismantled the artificial barriers between their worlds. On their final evening before Julian's departure for Singapore, they attended a performance of The Four Seasons at the Vienna State Opera House. When winter began, Julian reached for Octavia's hand in the darkened theater, both remembering where their story had begun. Later, walking along the Danube under a canopy of stars, they stopped at a pedestrian bridge. "I leave tomorrow," Julian said. "I know." Octavia leaned against the railing. 4 weeks went by too quickly. "They did," he agreed. "But they were enough." She looked at him questioningly. "Enough to know that I don't want a future without you in it," Julian clarified. "In whatever capacity makes sense as our lives evolve." Octavia took a deep breath. Long distance between Vienna and Singapore for 10 months. Followed by what? "That's the question you've been avoiding." She nodded, acknowledging the truth of his observation. "Because I don't know what comes next. My fellowship ends, your project ends, and then we're back where we started, with different lives, different obligations." "Not exactly where we started," Julian countered. "Because now we know what's possible." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not asking for certainty, Octavia. Life doesn't offer that luxury. I'm asking if you're willing to explore the possibilities with me, one step at a time." A street musician began playing violin nearby, the melody weaving through the night air. "I've been offered a position," Octavia said suddenly. "The fellowship director wants me to join their international program development team after my 6 months end. It would mean traveling to implement music education initiatives in different countries." Julian's eyes widened. "Including Singapore?" "Potentially. Asia is definitely part of their focus, something expanded in the space between them, not just possibility now, but probability solidifying into path. So the divide between our worlds," Julian began, "might not be as wide as we thought," Octavia finished. Above them, stars scattered across the Vienna sky like notes on a cosmic scale. Below, the Danube continued its eternal journey, carrying centuries of stories toward new horizons. "I don't know exactly what the future holds," Octavia said softly, "but I do know that meeting you changed everything, and I'm not willing to let that go." Julian's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with familiar certainty. "Then we figure it out together. Vienna, Singapore, wherever the music takes us. One movement at a time," she agreed. As they sealed their commitment with a kiss, their first but certainly not their last, the distant violinist shifted into a new melody. Neither Octavia nor Julian needed to look to recognize Vivaldi's Spring, with its promise of renewal and growth after the harshest winter. They had begun as strangers in different worlds, become catalysts for each other's transformation, and now stood at the threshold of a harmony neither had imagined possible. Proof that sometimes the most unexpected connections create the most beautiful symphonies. In the years that followed, their relationship would weather separations and reunions, professional triumphs and challenges, cultural differences and practical complications. But through it all, they maintained the fundamental truth they had discovered that night in Vienna, that authentic connection transcends circumstance, and that some divides exist not as barriers to be respected, but as challenges to be bridged by those brave enough to try.